So we're all here today to go over the CMDB Health Dashboard. And if you're not familiar with what it is, it's basically an easy way to evaluate your CMDB relationships and kind of your data, everything involved in your CMDB kind of pipes down into some easy at a glance reports that you can go ahead and modify. You can configure different ways so that you can get value out of your CMDB and actually see where things are kind of going wrong. We're going to go over a handful of things, right? So what is the CMDB Health Dashboard from a high level? What does it look like? What elements are on it? And then we're going to break it down into pretty much three different sections, which is completeness, compliance, and correctness, as well as relationship health at the end after we kind of talk through a little bit of that stuff, what it takes to keep the CMDB healthy, and at the end, questions and answers. I will say too, like there is no demo piece of this when you look at it in the agenda. That's because I'm going to kind of take a break in between each section to show you what I'm talking about. I think it makes sense to kind of talk about it, look at it, and go back and forth. So that's what I'm going to do. All right, so let's start with asking, what is the CMDB Help Dashboard? Kind of like I said, right? It aggregates key performance metrics, it offers actionable insights, and it's a place to kind of monitor and improve performance for CMDB. That all sounds great, right? But how do you use it? What value is it actually adding to your organization? Right? So these key performance metrics and whatnot, they look good at the start because you need to configure a bunch of stuff. And how do you actually take what that's giving you and actionalize that into, an effort that somebody has to make to maintain things? So why do you use the CMDB Health Dashboard? So it's critical to success, obviously, as it says. From an IT cost perspective, ServiceNow likes to toot its own horn and say it can save you about 40% roughly in IT costs. It's critical to avoiding unplanned outages, data quality in the CMDB. It's an essential goal of any IT organization. I think we can all agree on that. And it's kind of the black hole, right? You pipe information into your CMDB, and a lot of people don't know what to do with it. They think data's coming in, that's good enough. And what do you do with it once it's in there, or how do you evaluate what's actually in your system? So you can proactively manage issues as well. This is probably what I like the most about it. You can create tasks out of a lot of these metrics that have people go actually remediate things like, duplicate CIs, or what happens when you're not getting required fields. And, what happens if you have orphans in your relationships, things like that in your CI. So it's pretty useful. It can help notify people and make sure that you're improving your accuracy of your CMDB usability and act on any issues before they become major outages or anything like that. And it offers an easy at a glance view for stakeholder transparency. C-level people like to be able to see things in an easy way. This gives you fancy numbers and an easy way to evaluate kind of the overall health. It drives resolution for compliance failures and just basically tracks the overall health of your CMDB over time as well. So those are all valuable things. Let's jump into the elements of the dashboard. And this is where I'll probably stop and kind of show you some stuff along the way here, because, who wants to really see a list view of things I put together? All right, so there are, I wouldn't say three different dashboards available, but there's kind of different views of the CMDB dashboard. And you start with the CMDB view. There's a group view, which you can configure different groups and filters essentially to look at things. I'll show you that in a second, how you build that and what that looks like. There's also a service view. So you can kind of, instead of looking at everything at a glance, like that's what it does out of box, right? Is it kind of shows you, here's all your CIs, and it shows you everything. There's like a really basic way of filtering stuff, but you can get more granular with it. And that's basically the purpose of these dashboard views. And there's also several different elements that make up the dashboard, which is these tabs that I have laid out there on the slideshow for you, which is CMDB Health, Relationship Health, and CMDB Health Dashboard Jobs. So without further ado, let me pop up my dev instance here. So to start, up here in the application navigator, type in CMDB dashboard, and you'll see these three options that I was telling you about, right? CMDB view, service view, and group view. Let's just click the top one, CMDB view here, and you'll see kind of what I was talking about. All right, so here are the three tabs that I was mentioning: CMDB health, relationship health. You'll see each one kind of has all of its own metrics and whatnot. I'll talk about this one later. and then the CMDB Health Dashboard jobs. So let me just take a second to talk about this. So I believe out of box, these are all active equals false. So when I got my developer instance, I went ahead and I turned all of these on. These are your scheduled jobs that populate data in your actual dashboard. So step one would be to turn these on. I think the only one that was on was this top task generating CIs calculation. Everything else was off. So just go in here, active equals true. And most of them, I want to say, are scheduled to run, let's just take a look. Daily, 0300 hours. Okay, so it runs pretty much once a day. You can execute these at any point in time. And as I walk through some of these things, I'm going to show that to you. So the first thing, if you want to populate data right out of the gate, make sure that they're all active, come in here and execute each one of them. From then on, they'll run once a day, which is, we all know how scheduled jobs work. Anyway, so let's go back to this CMDB Health tab here and kind of talk through some of these elements that make up the dashboard. There are the CMDB hierarchy here, right? When I was talking about some basic filtering, notice right now it's all, so it's all CI classes. If you really wanted to get more specific, just to say Windows Server, you can look in here, and if this looks familiar, it's just like your CI class manager here. So just click here, and then you can select a class, and it will update all of this stuff based on what you choose here. So you can dial it in pretty well, I guess, if you're specifically looking for a certain class. That's all great. However, there are better ways of managing this. Let me take a step back here and make sure that I'm following along with my presentation. All right, so I talked through some of this stuff here. Let's go to the next slide and talk about what results are displayed. All right, so there's a CMDB hierarchy for filtering results, which I just showed you. There's the CMDB overall health scorecard, which basically takes the combination of your completeness, compliance, and correctness score and rolls it all up into one nice looking number. If you have everything configured, that's great, and it will actually add value. If you don't, it's going to look much higher than it actually is. So for any of us who have been asked to do a CMDB assessment, you come in here and you look at it and everything's green and looks good for the most part. That's because there's a lot of configuration that needs to happen behind the scenes to make this actually valuable. All right, so that was completeness, compliance, and correctness. It'll show you things like duplicate CIs, orphan CIs, and stale CIs. These are just going to be bar charts. I'm going to dive more into this a little bit later as well, because that has to do with a whole nother section called correctness. And then there's top generators for incident, alert, and change. And that sounds just like what you think it might sound like. It's basically a list view of your CIs, your top offenders, who creates the most incidents, what CIs create the most incidents, alerts, and changes. The alerts, just a note, that's for event management. So out of the box, you're going to see that that's blank until you turn that on. And then you would have to have alerts configured and everything set up there to make sure that that's actually pulling in data. So there's several different ways that results are configured and created. Just a high level overview here. I talked about the health dashboard scheduled jobs a little bit. You'll see me go back in there. I'll talk through that handful of times and you'll start to see how that all ties together. You have your score generators and rules. That 58% at the top right of the screen that you're looking at, that's basically a score generator. And the rules around it, you can say what the thresholds are. So it's showing up orange, and I think that out of box parameters, I don't know what they are off the top of my head. I'll show those to you, but it's you basically can set red, orange, and green and yellow and kind of these different colors corresponding to the health of your CMDB. And I don't know if people will actually get in there and mess with that, but I'll show you that as well. And the CI class manager, there's a tab in there called health, which you can see completeness, compliance, correctness, and health inclusion rules. So before I jump into completeness, let's take a look at some of these things that I talked about, right? I mentioned the group view, and then I want to talk about health inclusion rules. Let's go ahead and jump in here. So you type in CMDB dashboard, and as I said before, there are these different views here. So if I click group view, if I don't have any groups configured, you're going to see this little message that says no health groups currently created. Go to the CMDB groups to create one. And you'll see all of this stuff is blank here. So just like it sounds, I'm going to type in CMDB groups, open this in a new tab, and I'll come to this list view here. I added this column here, group type. Now, when you create a new group, what you're looking at, and I'll just name mine Windows and Linux servers. there's different group types here. The only one that'll actually show up on there is if it's health. So you can give it a description just for the sake of time. I'm not going to, but I'll submit this and you'll see it's the only one that shows up as health. So if I don't define a query here, it's not going to actually show anything. So click back into it and you'll see that this area shows up here. So I can create an encoded query. And what you're going to do is just build out a couple of these, right? So I said Windows and Linux servers, and you can see here right now, the only thing that's mandatory is your class. So I'm going to set this Windows, if I can type, Windows Server, submit this one. And I can add as many of these as I want to. So it's just going to basically aggregate everything together so that you can get a cohesive view of different groups of CIs. All right. Added those guys. Now, if I go ahead and reload, well, if I use a shortcut, refresh this, and then it should show up here. Now, when you create a new group like this, it'll show, but you'll have to rerun different jobs, which you can see the CMDB help dashboard jobs here. Cool. So you can see that this shows up now. If I add a handful of these, then you can go ahead and choose them. So this is going to be useful for end users, right? Say that they are interested in load balancers or they're interested in computers specifically. They can create these different groups so that they can view the information they actually want to see when maybe just the basic filter didn't work out for them. So if I want to populate all this data, again, going back to the three, there's the completeness, compliance, and correctness. So if I come here to the health dashboard jobs, you'll see their names pretty easy to understand: completeness, compliance, and correctness. So I'm just going to open each one of these in new tabs and just kind of show you what that looks like. You'll see me click around. All I'm doing is going to each one of these guys and I'm executing the scheduled job. So when I come back here, once these jobs get completed, see, completeness already populated there. A couple of these others kind of take a second, like compliance and correctness take a second to actually populate. But once they do, see that? And this is just for your specific Windows and Linux. And then once this one as well, correctness almost always takes the longest because it has the most work to do. Once that's updated, you can also refresh this guy too. So you can see and that this will get value for people who are specifically trying to refine things down. And again, if these dashboard jobs are active, they'll run once a day as well. So that's how you create those groups. All right, let me talk about how to exclude some stuff really quick. So I'm going to show you a health inclusion rule. So we'll go to CI Class Manager. This is kind of your bread and butter here, where you're going to do a lot of the configuration. If you're not familiar with CI Class Manager, it's pretty powerful. Really, I suggest looking into it if you're into the CMDB at all. You're probably familiar with it. If not, it's a good way to kind of get information at a glance. So I'm just going to, again, Windows Server, because it's a good example. And let's kind of take a look at some of this stuff. So right here, you have this tab, Health. So if I expand this, you'll see completeness, compliance, and correctness. And I mentioned the health inclusion rules. I'm not necessarily going to create one right now, but basically what this is saying, if I create a health inclusion rule and I say, I don't really care about recommended and required fields for Windows Server, I can go ahead and save this guy. And what this, it's almost more or less a exclusion rule. So if you create this filter and you add these selected fields, it's basically what's not showing up. So there are times where maybe you're creating specific orphan rules where you're like, you have a customer who does something kind of weird. They're like, hey, we have a weird relationship. Maybe it's something like, I don't want to see certain servers hosted in this specific data center because I just know that data's not there yet. So you could literally go into whatever class that relates to and then kind of walk down, and dot walk down to the right fields and say, I don't want to see it. And then you add this and you save it. And then when you rerun all these scheduled jobs, this isn't going to show up anymore on that dashboard. So I've had a couple of clients ask for that too. Completeness, let's kind of get into the nuts and bolts here of how to actually use this thing and configure stuff. So completeness, from a high level, you have two things that you need to be thinking about. Required fields, we all know what required fields are. They're mandatory. If you go into the dictionary of any record, essentially, there's the mandatory flag. This is really what this comes down to. Couple of things to note about required fields. When Discovery runs, it actually looks at this mandatory field and takes it pretty seriously. So if you say, hey, I need serial number, required is mandatory and it doesn't have one, it's not going to create a CI if it doesn't have that. There is, just let me add a note to that, there is actually a system property where you can overrule that. It's in their documentation. You can find it pretty quickly, but just know that that's a thing. So if you go willy-nilly and you say, let's make all the fields required, if Discovery is not getting it, then it's not going to create CIs. So maybe don't start there. So the next piece of that is recommended fields. This is pretty nifty because, well, nothing out of the box is specified, but recommended is kind of like your testing ground for fields that could become required in the future. So say that, hey, it would be great if serial number was mandatory. We're getting a bunch of garbage data. Maybe you go into that specific class and, again, Windows Server is my kind of example I keep using, but you say, hey, I want serial number on there. I want assign to on there, maybe even support group. And you can go ahead in the CI class manager, you can add these, you can see in this little pick list here, you can move it over and those recommended fields will then be evaluated on your scheduled job. So let's, again, take a quick break from this slide and actually look at the practical application of this. Go back to our dashboard. All right, and everything that I'm talking about right now relates to this piece. So CMDB completeness scorecard, 100% looks pretty good. Again, remember that recommended isn't configured out of the box, so that's going to show up as 100% right away. If you have no required fields, that's also going to show up as 100%. So if you do no configuration, this is where this whole thing can be a little tricky. It's going to make it look like your data is really good when it might not be. So let's look at a couple of different things. If you click this number right here, 100%, it's actually going to open it up into a more detailed completeness dashboard view. So this is where we start to see information that's actually relevant. CI is missing required attribute, no data to display, no data to display over here in recommended. That's because nothing's been configured. So CI class manager, again, is where we're going to go. We've all made fields mandatory, so let me just hopefully you won't be too bored while we're looking at this, but I think it's always good to see how things tie together. Let's go into Windows Server, and here we can look at a couple of different things. So if we're looking at mandatory fields, right, I click on attributes, and you can see right here from a list view, it'll show mandatory is false. As we already know from those reports, there are no mandatory fields. So if I was just looking here to say serial number, all right, it's this guy, click the little I, it's going to open up to the dictionary entry. All right, and you can see here the mandatory is false. Just note as well that this is specific to the class, right? So if I did this on the server level, not Windows Server, but server, it's going to inherit this field all the way down to all the child classes underneath of it. Windows Server, it will only be mandatory for here. So click here to edit it. And I'll go ahead and I'll make this mandatory. I probably wouldn't suggest starting here, by the way. Start with recommended fields first. So let's come back down here to the health tab, click completeness, and then you'll see a few things, right? So I mentioned these scorecards and rules previously and said, who's ever going to configure this? Well, if you were going to configure it, this is where it's going to be. Required field scorecard, once this loads, you'll see that there's just basically a minimum and maximum threshold, which corresponds to color coding. And if somebody said, I really want my required fields to be super efficient, and maybe you increase your threshold to say, hey, if it's below 90%, that's a red, so you can color code things. Let me just show this required fields scorecard. If I click new, see if this is the guy I wanted to show you right here. So if you wanted to adjust this from green, orange, or red, you can basically just come in here and set a value to say, this is just saying, hey, if 67% of your stuff isn't compliant with this, then it's going to be red. We all understand threshold, so I won't beat this up too hard, but this is how you would go ahead and adjust the color and at what percentage it changes colors on that dashboard. So for anything that has a color on it and a percentage, there is something like this in here, right? So it's going to be the same for compliance and correctness, recommended fields scorecard. All right, so I'll click on recommended fields. So this was like the screenshot that you saw on the other screen. So if I wanted to just add a couple of things, right? So we'll say assigned to, and then let's say owned by. I'll just add those two, save. Cool. All right. Let's go back to my dashboard. Actually, I can just run it from here. So keep in mind what I said before too. I'm going to come back here. I'm going to keep running scheduled jobs. So it's this completeness score calculation, right? Required and recommended is what I've been touching. So we're going to go ahead and rerun this job. Otherwise, results won't show up until it runs at 3 o'clock in the morning. So let's go ahead and run this guy. So after that loads, we'll start talking through compliance here in just a second, because this is actually where stuff gets a little bit more useful, I feel like. All right, here we go. Had some stuff run. So CI is missing required attribute. You see how that populated now, and it actually has some good information. You'll see that this all, again, has to do with Win server, the missing recommended, because that's where I did that one in the dictionary entry. I must have made a mistake there when I was doing that. I must have been in server. Anyway, okay, so when you click into here, it'll show your health results. So it's pretty cool. I'll just click an example of this. It creates all these records in here. So all I did was click into that bar chart and it opened up here. So here are all the records that have to do with that. And I can see the following required fields are not populated for serial number. So if I had a whole bunch in there, it's just going to show me what each one of these are. Notice that there's this task field as well. So if I want to do, I could go ahead and search for a task and relate it to that, or you can always click new and you can assign it to somebody as well if you wanted to do that. So that way people can actually take some kind of action with it, which I find is pretty useful. And it's going to be the same with recommended fields as well. You're going to, if I click into this, the recommended attribute, it's going to give me the same description of this as well, which is just going to say, hey, this is missing. It's going to give you a list and say, following recommended fields are not populated. So if you wanted to make something mandatory and you're running through discovery and you're like, hey, we really should have this information. Let's make sure that we know what it is. This is where you would probably start. Recommended fields, you'd add them there, and then you can just go each class at a time. You probably wouldn't want to be too general with it. You'd want to start with specific classes, which recommended fields there are, and then you can actually get some useful data from there. So moving on to compliance, back to the CMDB view. So that was completeness and the scorecard, what makes that up. Compliance has to do with audits, and this is a pretty cool feature because the useful application of this, think of things like if you wanted to find machines that weren't running antivirus or a specific software, right? Somebody, an organization manages their software using a specific piece of software. You want to make sure that's on all your computers. You could create basically an audit that will go out there, look at all of your devices, again, based on which class you're looking at, et cetera, and then it will pull back those audit results for you. So what makes up compliance are a few things. So the data, basically the question it's asking is the data doing what you need the CIs to be doing, right? And there's 4 different pieces of this that you can really use to find this information, which is a certification filter, certification template, an audit, and scripted audits. Scripted audits will be used in the dashboard. It's a good use case if you have something that's a little bit too complicated where just a simple filter won't really get the job done. Scripted audits can be used. Otherwise, if it's pretty basic, just stick to the certification filter, template, and audits. A couple of notes about this. So this is one of the areas where you can actually see on the dashboard, it is populated, right? 11%. Somebody might come in here and go, wait a minute, why is this 11%? So there are actually a bunch of out-of-the-box audits that are on and will be running. So you should look at those and say, maybe I don't want those on, or maybe you do. But either way, you should evaluate those to make sure that you are actually getting the information that you want. So I'll click into there. Let's go back to my screen. All right, so like I said, deactivate any out-of-box audits until you review them. And you'll have to create your own audits in here if you really want value from them. You can also create tasks directly from an audit. So say you were going to do an upgrade, pushing out the newest version of, a Windows Server operating system, because that's been my example. Yeah, and you want to make sure that you're auditing it to say, I need a specific amount of RAM, I need X number of cores, I need to make sure that this box is this old or whatever. You can run an audit to go ahead and look at those values and make sure that all of your devices have as much RAM as you need, they have as many cores as you need, and if not, it will show up in this audit list, and you can assign that to somebody to say, go ahead and remediate this, or decommission the server and let's spin up a new one, whatever it is you want to do. This is where you would do that. So I'm about halfway through on my time. So I'm going to try to just show you some of these audits and what they look like and kind of show you certification filters and stuff pretty quickly, so I don't just lose all the rest of the time here to this one section. But you can see CIs with audit failures. So I think what's helpful for this is to actually kind of walk backwards. Look at the end result and then walk back and see how you got there in this example. So let's take a look at some of these results that we're looking at. All right, so I'm just gonna, again, these are the out of the box guys. I didn't really create any audits, but you can see here, this is basically what it'll do is it'll generate this health result and it'll tell you what class, it'll tell you the description. So failed an audit for Windows computer minimum statistics, tells you the date, RAM, it needs to be greater than 1,000, discrepancy value is 503. So what we know is, again, you can come in here and you can assign a task. If I go into this audit itself, then I can actually automate this to create tasks. I can assign it to a group. I can assign it to individuals, whatever you want. Again, that's from the audit. And this is like super customizable or configurable. You can choose any number of fields. So now that you've seen this, let's kind of take a step back to see how you get there. So again, our old friend, CI class manager, is where you're going to probably do most of this. I will say though, this is one of the examples where if you type in compliance, you'll see audits, templates, filters, gives you an overview. I think this kind of blends different audits as well. I'm not going to pretend I'm an expert on auditing. If you wanted to actually look in there and see your different audits or templates from a list view, this is also a really easy way to do it. Otherwise, you're going to be in here in your CI class manager if you wanted to get specific. So let's do Windows Server. Open it up. Health, and now we're on the compliance tab here. So you can see I was talking about certification filters, certification templates, and audits, all these different things. So let's start here by looking at certification filters. So if I click into all Windows computers, basically you start by creating a filter, then you create a template. The template has to reference the filter. Then you create an audit. The audit has to reference the template. So the filter is kind of what you would expect, right? Computer operating system contains Windows. So that's your starting point. And then the template will reference this filter. So Windows computer minimum statistics. This is when you'll actually start to hone in what specific things you're looking for, what attributes you're looking for. So you can see the filter here is referenced, and you can see the condition. RAM has to be greater than 1,000. CPU count is greater than or is equal to 1. You can actually get deeper here too. Certification CI relationship conditions, user relationship conditions, certification group relationships, and related list conditions. So you can get really detailed in here if you want to build out your template. You can build, pretty much to your heart's content in here. There's a lot you can accomplish. And then the last piece, you'll go ahead and create the audit. This is where the actual functionality, it's kind of like a scheduled job, right? It's like, cool, you came up with your filter, you have the template, which refines what you actually want to search for. Let's go ahead and create a schedule and tell us what to do with this information. So if I click into audit, there's a couple of good things to see here. Again, this is where the template was referenced. If I wanted to create tasks, right, this is where you do it. Nifty little checkbox. You can say group field, specific group, so you can assign it to a group, which is probably what I would do if I did these. That way it's not just one person. You can run this on a schedule, so just like any other scheduled task or a scheduled job, so daily, weekly, monthly, periodically, once on demand, and then you have to run this audit. So you run the audit and then you have to go back to the dashboard and then run that other scheduled job. So if you have this guy running daily, then you have the other one running daily, it will update. So keep in mind, audits run independent of the scheduled jobs from the dashboard itself. But once you actually run one, right, then all these audit results start showing up. So these are all the devices that basically didn't make the cut, and it'll tell you why. So RAM, it's not greater than 1,000. If I did have a task, this would also be showing up. You click into it and it basically just takes all this data, pops it into a description and assigns it to somebody and says, hey, remediate this. So pretty useful. I would definitely say get in there before you turn on any of these dashboard jobs. Before you go ahead and you enable the compliance one, maybe make sure that those audits are reviewed and turned off. Otherwise, it's just going to start pumping out garbage data. And I'm just seeing Mark, thanks for your comment. Said often recommend to set the compliance widget to have no influence on the overall CMDB health scorecard. While a useful tool, the majority of use cases are not related to the health of the CMDB data. Yep, that's probably true. Thanks for that. So that's compliance in a nutshell. As you saw, you can get a lot deeper on that. All right, correctness. This is where I think most of the value is going to be like achieved here. So we're looking at things like duplicate CIs, orphan CIs, and stale CIs. And we're going to be looking at things like how do we configure and manage these results. Mostly deduplication tasks, right, are going to be the thing where there's going to be manual intervention happening there. You can also create workflows to handle those as well, but there is some level of manual intervention where somebody has to go through and actually do something with that information. Orphan rules as well, out of the box, there are no orphan rules turned on. So if you, for instance, created, I think the example I have here is a web application, is it running on a server? If you had a relationship you knew that you absolutely wanted to track and you said, if this server's out here, I want to make sure software is running on it, and you want to make sure that it wasn't just stranded out by itself. You want to make sure that there's a relationship between those. You'd have to go configure those. Otherwise, this just shows up as no data is available. And then another important thing to mention is there's only one staleness rule defined out of box. It's not going to really work for everything. I'll show you these guys here in just a minute, but those are some of the high level notes. All right, and now we're looking at the correctness scorecard, and there's actually, you'll see some of the correctness stuff actually shows up here on the widgets, the out of the box dashboard here. Duplicate CIs, orphan CIs, stale CIs. Again, I created these before. This Linux one probably isn't the best use case. This was one of those, I think for this, I said, hey, Linux server has to be in this specific computer room. This email server has to be running on a server. So I just went through and configured those guys so that there was some data here. Stale CIs, I haven't touched any of this information in here. So out of the box, you will get some staleness, but maybe it doesn't make sense. The out of the box staleness, rules for you might not make sense. So let's take a dive into the orphan CIs and stale CIs first, and then leave duplicate CIs for last, because this one's a little bit more involved. So going back to the CI class manager, I'll look at email server and show you the orphan rule that I created. All right, and again, going back under the health piece here, we're going to click on correctness this time. So duplicates is something that's handled by the system, the IRE. It will do some checks that really you don't have a ton of control over the duplicates piece, or I guess if you're really into the CMDB, you can probably adjust it, but it's based on identification rules and whatnot. So it's pretty good at finding duplicates in my experience, and you probably won't try to customize too much of that stuff. Anyway, so orphan rule, I will touch on that again. Clicking on the orphan rule here, I just had a basic relationship. So you can either do this based on attributes or a relationship. Again, I'm going into a specific class and I'm setting the relationship value here. So runs on a server is all that this was. So it's what it's going to do is when it runs this scheduled job, it's going to look at it and say, it's going to evaluate these relationships on the CI that fall under this class. And if there is not a relationship where it runs on a server, essentially, it's going to show up and flag it and say, why is this email server not running on a server? And then you can look at it and try to remediate it from there. Again, just to point out, these scorecards they work the way that I pointed out the very first time when we were looking at the completeness tab. You basically are just setting your threshold there. So let's actually look at one of these orphan CIs here. So I just clicked on this right here, and the data that we're looking at that pops up. Here's the health result. If you're seeing a pattern here, that's because this is how this works. CMDB health results, they show you what you're looking for, and they pull in some basic information like CI, class name, when it was evaluated, and then a basic description. So all that you're going to get from this is CI relationships do not satisfy the relationship rule. Again, if you want to go through and assign a task to somebody, you can. My kind of rule here is if you know for sure you have a relationship you want to see standardized across the board, find your golden child that was discovered and reference that rule, make that rule based on how that worked on that relationship. This is one of those, somebody's going to have a decent amount of knowledge about this to use this effectively, but it can show you stragglers or maybe places where relationships aren't happening the way that you would hope for. Looking at stale CIs next. If I want to look at the staleness rule, again, like I said, there's only the one out of box once it loads. Yep, it's every 60 days. So if a CI doesn't check in for 60 days, it just applies everywhere across the board. Well, let's just say email servers. Maybe this needs to check in a little bit more often. You just click new, and there are some too that, right, like maybe 60 days is a lot, maybe you want it to be 45 days. Again, that's on the CI level, so you may want to change the out of box one. You can go through each individual class and you can specify. So effective duration, if I just said every day, right, which might be a little excessive, but it is an email server, especially if you had just like one main one, well, you'd probably want that in there. So either way, you can change this. This is where you would do this. You can change days, hours, minutes, seconds, obviously. What you would want to do is you would want to look at it like, I think Linux servers, or like, let's talk virtual machines, right? Maybe if one hasn't been on for 60 days, maybe they pulled that data back and it's no longer relevant. So you want to figure out what to do with these types of things and kind of remediate those from there. So that's your staleness rule. Again, that's configured on each class, but the only one that's configured out of box is CMDB CI. So you can see how, as I've been talking through this, some of these numbers are going to be a little skewed when you look at it, right? This will be 100%. This will not have any data in it if you deactivate all those out of the box audits and you don't actually set up any. Orphans won't have any relationships in here. And then the staleness is based on 60 days hasn't checked in. Yeah, so there's definitely some information in here that you can update. Paul, yeah, he just brought up a good point. Would require you to run discovery or service graph import every day if you're going to have 1 day staleness rule. That's correct. So you would have to make sure. I wouldn't probably suggest to have a 1 day staleness rule. I think that was just an extreme example there that I did. You would probably want to do, set a threshold based on how often something checks in based on your schedules and things like that. All right, so I said I was going to talk about duplicate CIs, and indeed I will. So again, this is kind of a deeper subject. There is a lot of information out there on duplicate CIs, how to remediate them, and proper steps to take. I won't pretend to be a total expert on that process, but I can show you some simple examples that you want to run through. I will, however, quote Sandeep on this one, that when you are actually trying to fix your duplicate CI problems, fixing one-offs is fine, but what's actually more important is trying to find out where the cross-section of these issues is stemming from. So if you keep on having the same relationship, create the same duplicates over and over again, fixing that problem is going to be a lot more valuable to the organization than going ahead and assigning a task to somebody to remediate these guys over and over again. So you kind of want to systematically evaluate these, understand how these are being created, find the root cause, and then fix that problem. Otherwise, it's just going to keep happening. And though it will keep people busy, it won't be a good use of people's time. All right, so I just clicked this right here, and then we're going to look at the health results. So you'll see several things just at a glance here. So you have your CI, you have your task, your class name, last evaluated on. Pretty standard, right? It's the health results. And this is where it gets more useful, though, is when you actually click into this duplicate task. And by the way, before I go there, if you actually type in duplicate here, duplication tasks, you can actually open them from here and work them there as well. So you don't have to necessarily go through the dashboard to do it this way. You can go there. All right, so one of these tasks, what's it look like here? Duplicate records found in one class, computer. Okay, and it gives you some basic information here based on attributes specified in the identification rules for the CI's class. Okay, so again, like I said, identification rules are something that you need to know a little bit more about the CMDB to get involved in. You discovery folks are definitely like, yep, for sure. Anyway, so all duplicate CIs have identical values for below criterion attributes. So you can see here that there are a lot of duplicates in here. This would be a good use case for figuring out why this keeps happening, try to evaluate the relationship and whatnot. So there's a couple of ways of fixing these kinds of things. Step one, pretty much to click remediate. I would probably do this on a simpler example, I guess, one there where there's maybe not 141 dupes. But if you click remediate, it starts to pipe you through this duplicate CI remediator, which is recommended. Or like I mentioned earlier, you can use a custom remediation workflow here. Out of box, there are none. So if you knew you kept having this problem and maybe you didn't know how to fix it, but you knew how to patch it, or maybe some combination of the two. You could actually create a workflow that runs here to actually address the problem so you can get more detailed. Otherwise, you can use the duplicate CI remediator, and we'll just walk through. I'm definitely going to be interested in some feedback during this process because this is a lot of records to be looking at simultaneously here. Once you use this out-of-box duplicate resolver, it pops you into this screen, right? And you can select your main CI. So it tells you recommendations, most related items, oldest created, newest updated. A lot of this stuff keys off of discovery source, right? So I want to say, so the duplicates in the CMDB dashboard are derived from the CIs that are tagged with the discovery source field of duplicate. When this happens, a deduplication task record is created, listing or grouping all the duplicate CIs. A CI is tagged as a duplicate either during the ServiceNow discovery, identification phase, the IRE hardware rules used to identify if the CI exists or doesn't exist, and basically if an update or an insert should occur. If multiple CIs exist, and they're identified by the hardware rule, then the oldest CI in terms of the creation date, so you can see oldest created right here, is updated and its discovery source is defined as ServiceNow. If we start out here, essentially what we have are some options. I'm going to select my main CI. I'm going to say most related items. Let's just choose this one right here. And then we're going to go ahead and just choose to remediate manually so you can see some of these options that pop up here. And it's going to walk you through all of these things. So you can choose to merge attributes, right? So you can see the main CI value, other values. So there's a lot. This is why I said this might not be the best example, but this is going to be the kind of data you run into. So if we just accept all of these, right, you're going to want to go through here and modify what works for you or doesn't work. But I'm just going to take this and say merge all relationships from the duplicate CIs to the main. You can also say don't merge them, or you can choose specific pieces of it. So you can see it gets pretty detailed in here pretty quickly. You can also set attributes to custom values here if you wanted to. This is where you can say, oh, say I want to update it to whatever the heck I want it to, like assign to, I want it to be a specific person. Otherwise, you can just go ahead and delete. So this would delete all the duplicate CIs along with the reference records and everything, basically merging everything together, deleting all the others. You can see how easy this could be. Obviously, you'll want to evaluate all of these first. You would look through relationships and, related items and all these things to make sure that you're not going to just screw things up completely. And you can see it'll pop up all these. So again, you would want to review this whole process a little bit more thoroughly than I just did right there, but then it will go ahead and it will run this. So for each one of these deduplication tasks, it will actually pop up and give you these options. So this was the correctness piece here. Again, duplicates, orphans, stale, CIs. You can see how this would actually be useful. There's the relationship health, which is the last piece of this. I won't dive too deep into it, mainly because there's a lot to it and a lot of this is not super configurable. So again, this is just looking at your relationships. If you wanted to update any number of these things, it is possible to do just about anything, obviously, as we know in ServiceNow. But again, this is where you would come into the CI class manager and you can actually look at things like dependent relationships, right? And you can start to override dependencies. I wouldn't suggest this unless you really knew what you were doing. You can update suggested relationships in here. So remember before I said the duplication stuff was looking at identification rules. This is all in the CI class manager. If you don't know how to use this and you're in the CMDB, I would certainly take time to get to know this guy right here and how you can use it. Because you can see just right here, the health piece alone, what we've been touching was very useful, but you can also see all of these relationship rules right here. Depends on, runs on, connects to, all the stuff configurable and very useful. So there's a lot in there. I kind of glanced over this piece. Honestly, I haven't seen anybody use this super effectively. I would be interested in feedback if somebody else has and maybe better use cases. There's certain stuff you just can't configure in the relationship KPI health results. You can configure the scorecards, like I said, everywhere else. And then you can use the CI class manager to see your relationships. Outside of that, stuff that you would take from this and move forward with, right? How do you address the challenge of keeping your CMDB healthy? Well, you prevent bad data, which is easier said than done, obviously. That I think it starts in discovery. I think it starts on it's all additive. I think you can all see how it kind of talked through requiring certain fields and making sure data is coming in correctly, our model's correct, and et cetera. When CIs come in, maybe normalization. There's a lot you can do there to prevent bad data. But running and reviewing the CMDB data reports regularly. So running these scheduled jobs, having somebody who actually understands it and how it works, and then performing your data quality reviews, right? Somebody who can get in there again and look at these tasks, or they know really what's going on there. Choosing specific CI classes that you want to see, applications and servers and virtual machines and whatever, for the inclusion rules, to make sure you're actually getting the data that you want to see and not a ton of erroneous data. Determining required recommended fields, obviously, that's kind of like putting a squeegee on everything before it even comes in. Creating staleness rules so that you can figure out how to purge stuff that, maybe set an updated state when it hasn't been discovered in a while, so that, again, you don't just have an egregious amount of CIs that are old. And your orphan rules, as we kind of talked about. Things like applications being related to a server, virtual servers should be related to virtual machines, VMs should be related to hypervisor, WebSphere servers should contain EAR file, stuff like that, right? Like where you'll actually get value out of it. I'd like to open this now for questions and hopefully some answers.
Brett, it's a simple question, really. But when you went over the thresholds there, the 3367
Yep.
orphan staleness, and that, I'm often wondering, I've never seen from a client a real business case or a use case where those values would be set. So, I
Yep.
know you can set them there, but what, to present that to a client and just say, we recommend this, but for the following reasons, that's something I haven't been clear on. So be interested
Yeah,
to help on that.
for sure. I think if you had some infrastructure stuff, right, like maybe you set the threshold a little bit higher, say that you don't want duplicates of servers or something. I'm just tossing out an example. Maybe you set that threshold a little bit higher. You say, hey, if I have like a small number of these affected, I want to know and I want to draw attention to it. That's the only reason why you would do it. It's just a visual aid. There is no actual repercussion. If you set that threshold at 99% and turned it red, all it's going to do is just turn it red. So if something was more important to you, right? Like I would say an orphan or staleness type of thing, and say, hey, hold on, we have these infrastructure servers are stale. Then you draw attention to that specifically. I could see that being useful. Otherwise, I don't know. I don't imagine too many people getting in there and touching that. Yeah, I think Carl, that's a good call out. Customers like a healthy CMDB, but they don't like managing it. That's a good point. Let me go ahead and just plug in GlideFast there and say, well, that's what we're here for. We can help do that. Yeah, setting up the rules don't automatically make and or keep your CMDB healthy. I think that's absolutely spot on, Carl. People need to have a process that they follow, and people struggle with process, I think, and especially when it comes down to doing more. A lot of administrators might look at that and say, so I have to do more now? But really, it's preventative and it will actually help save them money. And I think if you can get management on board with that, that's actually the value you're going to get out of that. So Jesse asked a question, when you use the duplicate CI remediator, does it update so you don't get duplicates the next time you run discovery? My guess is it will go ahead and keep doing it. This is where you would have to either adjust the identification rules or figure out why those duplicates exist. It might not be as many as there once were at the onset of fixing the duplicates, especially if some of that data is really old, right? Some of it could be like a manual import. If somebody created them manually, then Discovery found it and they became duplicates, it should fix it. I would definitely say it'll reduce it, but this also goes back to what I was saying, that you need to identify the source of the issue and then fix that there. Otherwise, I would assume that it's going to do it again.
Yeah, I agree with, identifying the source. I was going to say that it kind of depends on a couple things. Are they only using Discovery, or are they using like service graph connectors as well? Because those could be bringing in duplicate data, and depending on the version of ServiceNow and how well they're using those service graph connectors and using IRE, all those things can come together or not come together and make duplicates happen. So if they're only using Discovery and they're on Tokyo, probably be in pretty good shape, but if they have anything else coming in and in an older way, then that could be a challenge.
Absolutely. Cool. Great questions. feel free to ping me if you guys have more questions on this. It's definitely an area I've been working on recently, and love answering questions and hearing feedback.